Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can see me and hear me. Am I audible properly? Ma'am, sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are. We can
All
hear
right.
you, Raghav.
All right. So, okay. All right. Just a second. I'll give you the access. All right. Hi, everyone. Very good evening to everyone. So, today we can see two people on the screen, Mr. Ashish Chavan and Ms. Riva Pocha. And
Good evening.
we are here for a webinar on deconstruction of evidence using forensics in the criminal procedure. So, talking about this topic first, I have received from many people this one query कि यार ये टॉपिक समझ नहीं आया, काफी कॉम्प्लेक्स लग रहा है टॉपिक. But actually, the topic is complex, but it is very exciting and it's going to make things easier for you in the courtrooms and in the proceedings where you have to understand things. So, talking about the team, Ashish sir and Riva ma'am, this is Team Facts. Facts is an organization which was established in 2009, and they have been working in, advising on forensics in consultancy and in trainings also. And they are associated with many colleges, very huge institutions like Symbiosis and other colleges, and also the Bar Council of Maharashtra and other such institutions where they are conducting training programs on forensics. So now talking about the topic a little bit, although ma'am and sir are going to elaborate a lot on it, and you're going to learn amazing things. So what we're going to do is, Abhi, we are going to talk about technology a little, how technology and how the new things, the technical stuff can help you crack cases. And also that's not only that, but also the kind of cases. So we are talking about complex cases like blood splatter, and we're going to talk about toxicology and DNA. These are the cases which are complex and difficult to crack, and also the cases where you make money and make fame and name for yourself. And while doing that, you have to understand कि forensics use कैसे हो सकता है, because most of the people do not know forensics होता क्या है. They think there are scientists who are there and they will be called to the court and they'll do the thing for them. But यहाँ पे forensics समझने की जरूरत है. If we know what is forensic, then we can use the science efficiently to the benefit of our client and to the case and to the court also. So that is precisely what we're going to learn, how to connect the classrooms to the crime scenes to the courtrooms, and how to use them to your benefit. Now, without talking too much, I'll give it over to ma'am, Riva ma'am. And before that, I'll just tell there are many people who are from the CRPC course and IPC, CPC course that Lawyers Club India has been, conducting in the last recent months. And I can see Charu, I can see Shantam, I can see Mr. Chauhan, Manoj Kuti. We can see many people there. They're lawyers, law students, everyone. And uh, so the idea is that we are going to learn how the subjects that we have learned, CRPC, IPC, हम सब पढ़ चुके हैं. Now we're going to go into the depth and going to learn about it. And the proper course, complete course on forensics, evidence, and CRPC is going to start from 17th of April. I'm going to send the link in the chat room while ma'am can start with the PPT. Thank you, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you, Raghav. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Ashish and myself, I'd just like to thank you for sparing your valuable time and for LCI giving us this platform to share our knowledge and our experience. Without much ado, I'm going to actually get into share screen and start the presentation for today. So this is just a little bit about our company, and I think Raghav has also covered all the bases. In a single line, I'd like to say that Ashish and I are both extremely passionate about being what we call forensic translators. And the reason for that is because we strongly believe that although forensic science can contribute to an investigation, there is tremendous trepidation and fear of understanding the science and using it in the courtroom. And so, our intention with the program that we will be starting on the 17th, and to some extent, Aaj bhi, we're going to try and break this fear. by making it interesting, exciting, and simplifying the science. So, with that, I'd like to just get into what is a forensic scientist, because I think what Janoko, they don't know what is a forensic scientist and what is the capability of the forensic expert. We all know about ballistics, we know about toxicology and poison studies, we might even know about blood spatter analysis, but do we know the diversity of the specializations? So, this is a small snapshot of what each of the divisions are capable of doing. And depending upon the type of case that you may be investigating or taking to trial, you may want to apply one of these forensic experts' opinions. And what happens is that each of these divisions has experience of years and years of evidence analysis and therefore is able to apply solid scientific principles to do analysis, produce a result, and then share it with the lawyers and the courtroom so that they can better understand what the evidence is trying to say. So it's kind of like giving the clue material or the evidence a voice and allowing the evidence to speak the fact, and it's always unbiased fact, not for prosecution, not for defense. It is what the evidence is saying based upon scientific analysis. And of course, the analysis is always court approved technology, court approved standard operating procedures, some of which we will spend time discussing when we get into the program, and a little bit we will introduce during the webinar today. So without much ado, I'd like to get on to the next point, which is what is the underlying principle of forensic science and why does it help the investigator or why does it help the entire judicial process? Now, some people who are practicing lawyers, I'm sure, have heard this fancy sentence, low card exchange principle or principle of exchange. This is actually the baseline of forensics. What we believe is that every crime scene or scene of offense has some sort of evidence or clue material at it that will provide connections that are vital to unraveling during investigation what has really happened. So that physical evidence is what is examined scientifically, and based upon the result obtained, connections or linkages can be made. And these linkages will always support the investigative process. They may corroborate, they may contradict, but they will always provide some information. The basis of this understanding is that when two surfaces come in contact with each other, and we are probably doing this right now as we sit at the tables, we touch our screens, we touch our faces, we are constantly leaving evidence behind. So, if in a very simple example, I can just talk about fingerprint analysis, as you go through your day, you are constantly leaving small physical evidence behind, which is the connection that we will provide scientifically and allow for investigation to use it. Ashish sir, would you like to elaborate or share how this is useful in any way?
Uh, well, what is the role of a lawyer in this webinar is something which I'm sure the audience will be wondering, because the normal perception is that forensics is a very complex subject, and in my limited experience of 15 to 16 years of hardcore practice in trial courts, I can tell you this, that the approach of normally the approach of lawyers to forensic science and forensic scientists is that it is something which is best left alone. उसमें नहीं जाना है. This is very complex. This is very difficult to understand. So coming to what you asked just now, the role of forensic science insofar as the entire procedure of law or the process of law starts at the investigation stage, and it culminates at the stage where the forensic scientist ultimately reaches the court and appears as a witness in a courtroom. So that, I would say, that is the ultimate pinnacle or the ultimate test of the forensic scientist, how he fares in the court, how his opinions fare in the court, and how he faces the examination and cross-examination, and how he unravels the entire case in the court. So yes, certainly you cannot over emphasize the role of a forensic scientist, and you also cannot overemphasize the role of understanding this science from the perspective of all of us lawyers. So I think this is a great move by Lawyers Club, and we can go ahead with it with the webinar.
So, as promised, we would like to discuss three prominent cases which will demonstrate how the forensic science has contributed to the investigation and ultimately in the court of law. Let's start with the first case, which is a basic drunk driving case. This is Alistair Anthony Pereira, who was caught drunk driving in 2006. As you will see in the details of the case, he was driving inebriated on the 12th of November 2006 at about 3:45 a.m. He crashed his Toyota Corolla car into the pavement at Carter Road in Bandra. Now, unfortunately, there were a lot of laborers who were sleeping on the pavement. They were part of a construction team that was working on a construction site nearby and had been sleeping on the pavement in front of their hutments. They were run over, 7 persons were instantly dead, and 8 others were injured. When the police arrived at the crime scene and they recovered from the car was 1 bottle of liquor, and a witness who happened to be a construction worker who was uh, he was part of the team that was involved in hiring these people, the laborers. He happened to witness the scene, and he was the labor contractor who actually filed the FIR immediately at the Khar police station. So he was a witness to the actual crime being executed. On medical examination, once the police arrived at the crime scene, they apprehended the accused. They took him for medical examination, and the medical examination involved withdrawing the accused's blood, checking the blood for alcohol levels, and the number that was reported was 0.112%. Now, you may ask me, what does this mean? This basically means that in the blood of the accused, there was 112 milligrams of alcohol per 100 ml of blood. Now, what is the legal limit? How does this have any understanding or bearing on us as lawyers trying to figure this out? The legal limit is 0.03%. So we can see how much in excess to the legal limit the accused had in their blood. Therefore, one can also understand and appreciate, if you know this number and you understand this number, you would understand what this does to the body, and therefore what it does to the reaction time or the motor coordination of somebody who is doing something as intricate as driving a car. So the accused was tried under the IPC sections as shown under, I think Ashish will be talking about this in a little more detail, so I'll get on with the details of the case. Now, Alistair Pereira did admit to driving the car, but what he said was that I was not inebriated, I was not drunk, I lost control of the car because there was some sort of mechanical defect in the car, and I therefore was unable to control it. So this is not a case of rash and negligent driving. He did not admit to rash and negligent driving. He said that he had lost control of the car. Of course, the case went to trial. In the Sessions Court, he was found guilty, but he was convicted of a lesser offense, and that was death by rash and negligent driving, not of culpable homicide. Again, Ashish will go into a little bit of detail about this later. However, in the High Court, he was convicted for culpable homicide and maintaining all other offences like rash and negligent driving, and those under the Bombay Prohibition Act and under the Motor Vehicles Act. Deliberations in the Supreme Court rested a lot on legal issues like framing of charges and failure of the court to execute the powers under Section 313 of the CRPC. Once again, this will be discussed in a little more detail. It suffices to say that by 2012, this case was closed. Final judgments were passed by Supreme Court, and there was a compensation of 8,50,000 that had been paid to victims' families by then. Supreme Court also upheld the High Court's sentencing of 3 years imprisonment, and interestingly noted that in their opinion, the sentence was a bit lenient, but since the state was not filing an appeal, there was nothing to probe further. So let's move into the criminal procedure. Ashish, would you like to take over?
Yes. So I think, madam, you have already covered all the the essential legal facts that are necessary for us to understand what the case is all about. But this is not a lecture on law, so I will not go deep into what were the legal submissions which were canvassed by the council at the various forums. Suffice it to say that there were challenges to the way and manner in which the charge was framed, the way and manner whether there was a joinder or misjoinder of charges, and whether the incriminating material which is required to be put to the accused under what is called as the accused statement or a 313 statement popularly, whether it was put properly or not. But leaving aside that legal jargon and legal thickets, if we look at the relevance of this judgment in the realm of forensic science, then we have three issues which come to the fore. The first issue is, as Riva madam was at pains to explain, unacceptable high level of alcohol was found in the blood analysis of the accused. The blood sample was taken by the doctor, as Riva madam pointed out, at the time of the medical test of the accused. Now, this is again a legal procedure. Let us remember, all of us who have read CRPC know what sections are there, and of course, we'll talk more about it in the course. But these are all legal procedures, and during these legal procedures, the blood sample was drawn. The blood analysis was carried out by somebody who is called as a serologist or forensic scientist who performs the analysis of blood. Now comes a very interesting aspect of the chain of custody. Now, chain of custody is basically the journey of any any sample. It could be blood, it could be DNA, it could be semen, it could be anything else. From the investigating machinery to the laboratory of the forensic scientist. And that chain of evidence, there must be authentication and validation of every step that happens. So to put it in a very simple language, मैंने अगर किसी होटल से एक 4-5 आइटम मंगवाए, let us say, or by the time those items come to my office, they encounter various hands. जो शेफ बनाता है, he prepares one item. That item goes to the waiter. The waiter probably does something around with it, fiddles around with it, maybe eats half of it or whatever, we don't know. And ultimately करते करते मेरे ऑफिस में पहुंचता है. आधी चीजें ठंडी हो जाती हैं, आधी चीजें जो मैंने मंगवाई वो होती ही नहीं है, आधे के पैकेट्स टोर्न होते हैं. So this is where what basically happens. What I would say in a legal perspective is breaking of the chain of evidence. The chain of custody जो होती है, that is basically to ensure that when I am putting a particular liquid or a particular material in a particular test tube, that test tube in its entirety in the same manner has to reach the particular laboratory. And there are various checks and balances which are inbuilt to ensure that that journey happens in a smooth manner. When it does not happen in a smooth manner, that is where there is an irregularity which is reflected in the procedural aspects and which is also brought out by the defense lawyer, or it can be brought out even by the prosecution lawyer. So the important concept, the legal aspect of the important concept here is that the chain of custody had to be maintained from the time the samples were collected right up to the time that they went to the forensic scientist, and the forensic scientist opined on those samples by way of his the analysis report. The third aspect was that if you see that this was alleged to be an accident, because that was the defense portrayed by the accused, that A, there was a mechanical failure, and 2, that there was no inebriation or he was not under the influence of liquor. So what was a game changer here? The game changer was a spot panchanama. A spot panchanama is basically an authentication of something which happens contemporaneously. So if I'm sitting in my office right now and talking to you, and if somebody is conducting a panchanama here, he would come and say that there is a human being here, a gentleman wearing a black jacket and a tie, and he's speaking something in what looks like a laptop. So this would be an authentic reportage of a panchanama which is contemporaneously going on in my office right now. So the same way, there was a spot Panchanama, and normally spot Panchanamas are conducted in road traffic accidents, and they are extremely relevant and extremely important. Uh, in this spot Panchanama, two things happened. One, it was very clearly noticed that the vehicle was very badly damaged. In fact, the entire right side wheel was completely dislodged. Now, what does it primarily show? That it took a very heavy impact. Okay, so that was the first observation. Then there was a mechanical expert who was called to basically conduct a analysis of the entire damaged vehicle and the surroundings. This mechanical expert found his way in evidence also. So he was a prosecution witness, he was cited in the charge sheet, and he was subsequently examined by the prosecution. And what does he say? He says that there was no mechanical defect of the car. So he dealt with the defense theory that there was a failure in the car and there was a mechanical defect, because of which he had no control over the car and because of which the car suffered an accident for which he was not responsible. So that theory was completely demolished by the forensic scientist, namely the mechanical expert who conducted an in-depth analysis of the scene of offense and the vehicle, and he found out that there was no mechanical defect. So that's why you realize how important, how much importance it assumes now, viewing it from this particular lens. He also opined that there was a 70 feet long brake mark. A brake mark is where you apply brakes, or and then the car starts skidding. So in drag race movies, you often see where a vehicle takes a particular dangerous turn, the person applies the vehicle the way applies the brakes, and then the vehicle starts skidding, and the skid marks are directly proportional to the velocity of that vehicle. So if the vehicle is traveling at a very great speed, it will take a very long time reasonably to come to a grinding halt. And here there were 70 feet long brake marks, which means that the vehicle was driven at an extremely high speed. So if you look at it from the legal perspective as a lawyer, two, two things were game changers here. One was the spot Panchanama, which ultimately proved that the vehicle was damaged because of high impact. Second was the evidence of the mechanical expert who opined that there was 70 feet long brake marks and skid marks, which demonstrated that there was a high velocity, and also the aspect that unacceptable high level of alcohol, ethyl alcohol, was found in the bloodstream of the accused, which made him difficult for him to basically have control over his senses. And this, I think, from the lawyer's perspective, from the procedural aspect, is a very important thing. So this is how we are connecting forensic science on one hand and law as we see in practice on the other. So we can move on.
So coming back to certain issues that require maybe a little more forensic understanding. As Ashish pointed out very clearly, we are building an understanding of what happened at the crime scene. Now, a large part of that understanding is based upon establishing whether the blood alcohol of the accused was higher levels that would impair his activities or would not allow him to be able to even control the car, given there might have been mechanical failure. He's already talked about the integrity of the sample in the chain of custody to be maintained, so I'm not going to get into that. But let me talk a little bit about understanding that 0.112% weight by volume. So, by nature, any human being who eats food or anything that we eat, we all know this. We eat lunch at 12 o'clock, by 4 o'clock, bhok lagi. We want to eat something else. The reason for that is because our body breaks down whatever goes inside. So even using that scientific theory, alcohol when ingested is going to break down in the body. Therefore, once it is breaking down in the body, it is leaving the blood and it is getting through the system on its way out of the system through excretion. Now, when the scientist can explain the physiology and make the law and the court understand what is naturally happening in the body, one gets a better understanding of how that alcohol level can impact the driver and further strengthens prosecution argument in this case to say that the driver could not have been controlling the car very well, which is what also accounts for the 70 feet of brake marks, which accounts for the severe damage that ended up because of the hard impact of the car, supported by the spot panchnama and the spot analysis. So what is happening is the forensic evidence or the blood alcohol level, the documentation by the motor vehicle expert, this is all providing factual information that helps us understand what is possible and what is not possible, and therefore strengthens the lawyer's arguments. There is always supportive literature and published materials, especially in terms of alcohol intoxication levels. When are you actually drunk? A lot of people have asked me when I do seminars, one of the first things I get from lawyers is, so how many drinks can you have before you're drunk? How many drinks can you have before you get behind a wheel? And the actual truth is you can't. After a certain point, the alcohol is still in the blood. Technically, if you look at any literature, it will tell you that within 90 minutes, if you're on a hungry stomach, the alcohol is leaving the blood. But that does not mean that the motor coordination is automatically back. It still means that you are not functioning at optimum level. So drinking and driving within 1, 2, 3 hours is always a risk because the alcohol levels are still in the blood. Having said that, I want to spend just 1 minute on the procedural delays because we have stated this here. Given that we understand that this is a biological system and automatically breakdown of alcohol and exit of alcohol from the body takes place, this is a timed reaction. So if we delay procedures of taking accused from crime scene to the medical facility so that they can be examined, the alcohol has not stopped. The person has not stopped and said, okay, now let my alcohol level stay like this until I get to the hospital. So it is also an issue in terms of procedure that the hospital must receive the accused quickly, analyze the blood levels quickly, and move those blood samples for analysis in a timely manner. In this particular case, 12th was date of collection, 14th was date of arrival of samples at the laboratory. So again, like Ashish said, chain of custody is an issue. What was happening in those 2 days? So I think this kind of wraps up this particular case where we've tried to demonstrate how forensics has played a valuable role in the investigation and trial in establishing or strengthening arguments. What was the importance of this judgment? This was a landmark judgment. And one of the things that needed to be noted is that based on the NCRB records, a total number of road traffic accidents in India every year is now in the region of 1.5 lakhs almost. And a lot of them are facilitated by drunk driving. Therefore, this particular judgment with sentencing under 304A became a landmark judgment, hopefully in the form of a deterrent to drunk driving. Ashish, do you want to add anything to this before we move to the next case?
If you examine judgments after this, and this is a very important judgment. If you examine judgments after this, you will find that the invoking of Section 304A IPC. See, earlier, there was a conception or a misconception amongst law enforcement agencies that any and every hit and run case is necessarily 304A IPC. And they were very, very reluctant for various reasons to invoke and incorporate the stringent provisions of 304 Part 1 or Part 2. Basically, because of certain understanding or lack of understanding of how the law works. I think this judgment was a trendsetter insofar as the application of Section 304, the culpable homicide not amounting to murder, and how it can be invoked in given circumstances in peculiar conditions in accident cases also. So in all ways, this is a landmark judgment.
Okay, we're going to switch gears now and focus on a murder trial. This particular case dates back to 1997 and it involves the murder of a very young 22-year-old tourist, New Zealander girl. Her name was Diana Claire Routley. She was traveling through India as most tourists do and decided after Agra she was going to travel up to Varanasi. She arrived in Varanasi on the 7th of August and she stayed at the old Vishnu guest house. She also was accompanied by some female friends who left the following day, leaving her alone at old Vishnu guest house. On the 10th of August, a few days later, she had plans to travel to Darjeeling by train. And so she was seen leaving for the train station at 7 o'clock in the morning, but thereafter she disappeared. So the police conducted initial inquiries based upon a phone call from her father in New Zealand, who said that she had suddenly disappeared and he wanted some sort of investigation done. Unfortunately, there were no investigative leads, and so this case became a dormant case. However, the father continued to probe, explore, and finally, in July 1998, almost 1 year later, he traveled to India and lodged an FIR under Section 360C, which is 366 IPC, for kidnapping. Now, he was very clear that he was confident, based on whatever communication his daughter had had with him while she was in the Vishnu guest house over those 2, 3 days, that she had met the accused, Dharamdeo Yadav, on multiple occasions. He was employed by the guest house as a tourist guide, not a regular employee, one off employee, sometimes there, sometimes not, and he had interacted with her. So the father was convinced that if there is any information about his daughter, either this person, the accused Dharamdeo Yadav, knows the girl and is involved in the case, or he knows information about it. So what happened was, a few days later, as you can see by the timeline, 19th August, the police received information that this Dharamdeo Yadav, the accused, was arriving at Varanasi station. They met him, interrogated him, and finally he confessed to actually murdering Diana by strangulation. He also, at that point, stated that there were three other people who had helped him in committing the crime. So, what the police did was they said that they wanted to see the body, they wanted to identify where she was, and he claimed that she was in his village. So, he, along with the police, went back to the village, unlocked his own house, opened his house, let the police inside, and then pointed to a space in the ground where he claimed Diana had been buried after he had strangulated her. The police asked him to dig up the spot and excavate the body of Diana. By this point, it was 1 year later, so the natural degradation process of a human body led to it being completely skeletonized. That means there was no tissue left, there was absolutely no features left. It was the skeleton of a body. So you may appreciate at this point that based on a skeleton, how are we going to identify that this is actually the body of Diana? And the court wants to hear that. In the end, this is a murder trial. Again, Ashish sir will get into some of these sections and give you details. I just want to talk to you a little bit about how the process evolved and the facts of the case. During trial, there were 27 witnesses examined by prosecution. Some of these witnesses even claimed to have seen Diana with the accused at the train station. And subsequently, through the trial, the three co-accused were acquitted, and the main accused, Dharamdeo Yadav, who had admitted to strangulating and killing her, was given the death penalty. This was reaffirmed by the High Court, and eventually, on appeal, this reached the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, the death penalty, which is given for rarest of rare cases, was commuted to a life sentence. And the reason for this is because, unfortunately, there was no clear indication on cause of death. And therefore, they had to commute the sentence to life. Ashish sir will talk about procedural issues now on this case, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the forensics.
Again, to amalgamate or try to come at a midpoint between forensic analysis and forensic science and the criminal procedure, I will not go deep into the pure aspects of law. Now, again, three issues come to the fore when you deal with this case. The first is the aspect of circumstantial evidence. So, circumstantial evidence broadly, of course, every one of us has gone through the basics of law. So, we know what circumstantial evidence is. Simply put, circumstantial evidence is nothing but the circumstances pointing out telltale clues which ultimately lead to the establishing the guilt of the accused. or the innocence of the accused, as the case may be. So, and as a branch of law, as students of law, we all know how difficult it is to establish circumstantial evidence and to build up that chain of circumstantial evidence to such an extent that it leads to only one inescapable conclusion, that the accused is either innocent or guilty. So, at one particular logical conclusion. Now, in this case, there is a very interesting subsegment of circumstantial evidence. So, if you look at circumstantial evidence like a tree, there are many branches to this tree. Now, one branch we can look at here. That branch is the theory which is popularly called by defense lawyers or by criminal lawyers generally as the last seen together theory. Now, what does this theory say? That normally the person with whom the murdered person or the person who has lost his life because of a homicide is last seen with that individual. It is that person who has to give some kind of a logical explanation as to what happened to the person who subsequently was the victim of homicide or who was subsequently murdered. Now, this is more or less the theoretical aspect of what we call as the last seen together theory. Also, it has various parameters which the Supreme Court has discussed, not only in this case, but in a number of other cases. But here it came to a conclusion based on the particular facts of this case that there is no inflexible rule that just because a particular person is the last person seen with the deceased, it necessarily not lead to a conclusion that he has committed the crime. So obviously there must be other corroborative elements that have to be looked for, and only when those are complete can that chain be complete and the accused be that it can be established beyond a shadow of doubt it is that so and so person has committed the crime. So this is the subsegment of circumstantial evidence which is reflected in this case. The other aspect is section 27, which is again a very popular section amongst criminal lawyers, because it forms the very basis of so many murder cases or so many criminal cases wherever there is any recovery or discovery. So again, of course, we'll go into the depth of it during the course, but at this point of time, let me just explain it a little simplified version of this by saying that normally any statement which is made by the accused to the police is not admissible. Now there are exceptions to this rule. Of course, there is a whole branch of law which deals with it. We will not go into the depths right now. But suffice it to say that section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act is one such exception. So where that information, that limited information which the accused gives, which is non-inculpatory, so that evidence should not inculpate him or it should not incriminate him, that non-inculpatory part of that information which leads to the recovery of that particular thing or that particular object which ultimately connects him to the crime, that part of that particular information is supposed to be is admissible and can be proved in the eyes of law. Now this is a very simplistic explanation of section 27. Section 27 by itself is a 1-hour topic, so let us not go deeper into it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the recovery of the skeleton. So remember one thing, when Madam was reading out the earlier slide, the police made this person dig out that particular place, and from that particular place the body was recovered. So the location of the body was known only to that person who that is the accused, who dug up that particular place. So it cannot be said that somebody else has killed that person and put it there. So this is how basically section 27 of the Evidence Act connects the weapon or the article or the object used in the commission of the offense to that information which leads to the discovery of that particular object. So this is again a very interesting, exciting topic which will come. We'll discuss more when we are dealing with the course. And the third important legal aspect is search and seizure. So search and seizure from the investigative perspective is, if you have read the Mahabharat, you will realize that Karan had had Kavach and Kundal. So these were the two things that were gifted to him by his father, the Sun Lord, and that protected Lord Karan from any evil things, bad things. So in the same way, search, seizure, and arrest, these are the Kavach Kundals of any investigating officer. So these are the, these are the things that the investigating officer in the Indian criminal justice system is given, so that he can independently and impartially carry out the investigation. So during this, so search is a topic by itself, various kinds of searches. Seizure is a topic by itself, various different aspects of seizures. Then we come to the aspect of various kinds of panchanamas during the seizure and search, which are really very interesting, and which all connects back to the forensic element of this entire thing. Now, in this particular case, during the search and seizure, there was no independent witness present, which dilutes the authenticity of the entire search and seizure. So, which of course brings us to the entire to the very interesting topic of what are the parameters of a good search and seizure operations. Of course, you will have to wait for the answer. That answer we'll discuss in the course that follows. We can move on to the next judgment, please.
So from the forensic standpoint, there's only one fundamental question that is extremely relevant in establishing the guilt or innocence, and that is, who is this skeleton? Is this skeleton in fact that of Diana Claire Outley? Now, like Ashish rightly said, the accused knew where the body was buried. The accused was the one who actually dug up the body. The accused, therefore, indirectly implied that it was Diana Routledge. But that is not going to help the court. The court needs to understand factually, based on science, that this is actually Diana. And so, what was interesting in this case was multiple scientific techniques were used to reaffirm that this is the body of Diana Routledge and no other skeleton. What were some of the techniques that were used, and what were some of the questions that needed to be asked? This is just a general basic idea. Of course, in the program, we will go into a lot of depth on how these techniques are done and what are the downsides and the upsides of doing these analyses techniques. But very briefly, just to give you an indication, in a situation where you have only a skeleton, normally the identifying features are your facial features, your hands, your fingerprints, maybe a tattoo, maybe a birthmark. None of this is present suddenly. Now you only have bones. Bones to the layperson looks the same from one person to another. So what are we going to do forensically or scientifically to establish with the court that this is without a doubt the body of Diana Routledge, the victim in this particular case? So what was done was superimposition, which is a technique that involves taking the skull. Now in this particular case, 1 year had passed. So when Diana was dug out of that so-called grave, she still had some of the hair on her head, which was covered in soil naturally because she had been buried, but the rest of her body was completely without skin. However, the musculature, the muscles surrounding the long bones, which are the bones in the legs and the bones in the arms, some of that was still there. Again, this is a normal process the human body goes through. Once it dies, it will decompose. So this is part of the same procedure. The bones have bone marrow, what we call bone marrow, uh, what is creating the blood cells in the body. Now that bone marrow is somewhat protected inside the skeleton and therefore provides us a source even after 1 year of identification. So as far as forensics is concerned, they were able to use some basic techniques of blood grouping and DNA analysis, which allowed them to provide a profile that could be undisputedly that of Diana Claire Outley. What the exact techniques were and how they are done we'll get into detail in the course of the program, but suffice it to say, dental records, the shape of the skull, taking photographs of the skull of Diana while she was alive and superimposing them on the skeletal, certain teeth missing, certain cavities that were filled, these were matched, cut to cut match, and as a result, confirmed that it was her. Blood grouping showed that it was her blood group, A type blood. And finally, of course, the DNA comparison, which was done. The DNA is the recipe of how to make you. and it stays with you. This recipe makes you from birth to death. And interestingly, from a genetic standpoint, you inherit your DNA from your parents. So her father was asked to donate blood, and the minute there is a 50% match with the father's blood, it confirms that there is a relationship there. And this was established through the DNA profile. So once again, you had triple confirmation from a scientific standpoint that this was definitely the body of Diana. So then you may ask, what commuted the death penalty to life imprisonment? That was the one unanswered question. And that was at the post-mortem examination or the autopsy of the body. They were unable to establish the exact cause of death. They had been told by the accused, he had confessed to saying he had strangulated her, but any kind of strangulation markings would have been on soft tissue, would have been on the skin. We didn't have any of those markings anymore. Interestingly, this case did show in the postmortem examination that she had a hole through her chest area, and that would have been indicative of possible gunshot involved. But thereafter, the natural progression scientifically would be to say, okay, so maybe she was shot because a little bit of garment that had decomposed, clothing items also showed multiple holes. It was a t-shirt, and both front and back also showed the matching holes. But then the next question would be, so what kind of firearm? Where is the gunshot residue? These questions remained unanswered because there was compromise of evidence. This did not take away from the fact that it was Diana Routely. All it did was it took away from the confirmation of cause of death. So, as a wrap up on this particular case, the forensics actually strengthened the proving of the fact that this was the body that was buried in the house of the accused. This once again was a landmark judgment, and the reason I bring it up and we've highlighted sections is because the justices Radhakrishnan and Sikri both made a note of talking about the emerging techniques in forensics and that they needed to now be recognized and utilized in the courtroom. They make a very clear case talking about how witnesses can sometimes be unreliable. Let's shift the focus of the court to understanding the science, strengthening the science techniques and the scientific protocols that are being followed, and using that interpretation and analysis in the courtroom to prove the crime rather than relying on oral testimony all the time. Would you like to add to this, Ashish? Okay, so that takes us to the last case for this evening. Ashish.
Yeah, basically, this is one judgment which I have called out, which is talking about a cyber crime. So, the field of forensics takes in its sweep so many technologies, and one of those technologies is, of course, the ever expanding horizon of cyber technology and digital footprints, digital signatures, digital offenses, electronic documents. All these are now becoming everyday words in our language. And of course, when something becomes very popular, it also creates various negative as well as positive aspects. And today we are going to talk about one such negative aspect of the information technology. Now, we all know that Information Technology Act was passed in the year 2000. Now, the main twofold objective of this Information Technology Act was A, to give legitimacy to e-commerce, because till then e-commerce was not did not have any protective umbrella of the law, and secondly, to recognize the concept of electronic documents in law, because people were using electronic documents, but there was no sanctity of law behind those electronic documents, and therefore it was necessary to legitimize them in some kind of a code, and therefore the Information Technology Act was passed. Interestingly, it also gives us the definition of the word computer and computer systems. So these are the three most important aspects of the Information Technology Act. Now, what is the focus in this case? Basically, what we are going to talk about is the tampering of the computer source documents. which is the source code. Now, what is the source code? Again, I'm going to make it simple for you because I am anyway not a a computer scientist. But what I understand by the legal definition or the legal understanding of source code is that source code is basically like a DNA of a machine or of a computer system, where the if you want to alter the source code, you have to alter the lines of that code and to transform the entire code, so that it's like changing the DNA of a person, which is something which is akin to killing that person or to finishing or terminating that person. So technically speaking, when I'm tampering with a computer source document, I am putting an end to that computer entity, if I may say so, if I may take the liberty of using that kind of an expression. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So now today we have your GSM phones, which are your smartphones, which we normally carry in our pockets, and we use it for almost everything. Yesterday's computers have become today's phones. So, but in 2000, we had a technology called a CDMA. If any of my friends are, of course, I don't consider myself that ancient, but in 2000, there used to be CDMA phones, and which were very popular. They were clunky, large phones, and the technology used by CDMA is drastically different from what the modern day smartphones we use. Now we have 5G, we have LTE, we have various kinds of technology, basically, which come under the umbrella of GSM. What is GSM? GSM is basically Global System for Mobiles. This is the acronym. GSM is an acronym for Global System for Mobiles. So in 2000, there were CDMA mobiles largely, and the GSM system was relatively underdeveloped. Now, at that relevant time, Reliance had come out with a very attractive scheme for subscribers. And what was the scheme? The scheme basically was this, that they used to offer a high-end latest handset, which was latest according to those standards, 2000 ka standards. And they also used to give an attractive tariff option. Basically, the tariff option was very attractive, and they reduced the down payment, and the monthly EMIs were very less. So to give you an example, the market cost of that handset at that point of time was 10,000 rupees, which was a princely sum in 2000. And the down payment at that point of time which a customer had to make was 3,500 rupees. So in 3,500 rupees, he gets that 10,000 rupees worth handset in his hand, and he can use it. And he gets to pay a monthly EMI of 600 rupees with attractive tariff options. This was, of course, a method by which Reliance wanted to attract a lot of subscribers. Now, interestingly, there was a lock-in period of 3 years of that handset. So the handset remains the property of Reliance, and the ownership of the property does not pass on to the subscriber. Unlike when we today buy a phone, it becomes your property. So technically, there was a lock-in period because there were certain implicit contractual arrangements by way of which that entire process used to work. Okay. So now what is the offense in this whole thing? That employees of a rival service provider, we don't wish to go into details of who was those rival service providers. You can find out that judgment is for everybody to see. Those rival service providers, some of them started a scheme where they used to attract the subscribers of that handset. So if you have a handset, you used to be approached by one of the rival subscriber personnel, somebody, and he used to say, sir, we have got a very interesting tariff option for you. You can keep your phone. You don't need to change your phone. You have to give the phone to us for a few hours. We will reprogram it, and we will make it in such a way that you can enjoy our tariff at a lower price, of course, and you can use the phone which is given to you by the other service provider. So what actually used to happen during those 2 hours is the phone used to be taken away, the source code used to be tempered and altered, and that phone used to be reprogrammed so that it could suit the frequencies of the rival service provider. So now this was the crux of the whole fraud which was being played. Now, ultimately, there was a written complaint which was filed by some of the persons who got cheated, of course, the representatives of Reliance, and basis that written complaint, there was an FIR registered. The FIR was registered essentially for criminal breach of trust, because that those phones, remember, were the property of Reliance. They never changed hands. And cheating because there was a monetary component involved. Apart from a very interesting provision of the Information Technology Act, which speaks of tampering of source documents. So, this is section 65, which essentially speaks of tampering of the source documents. Now, of course, there was a whole lot of discussion about the legal aspects of whether there was any cheating there, or whether there was any criminal breach of trust, etc., etc. But what is interesting is the forensic angle here. Two questions fell for consideration before the court. One, whether a mobile phone or a handset is by itself a computer system or not. And two, whether this reprogramming amounts to change or tampering of any source documents or not. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, of course, there was a recovery of 63 Reliance handsets, which is the part of the investigating procedure. And after the investigation was started, the modus operandi which was discovered by the police is what I just narrated to you 5 minutes ago. So this used to be the standard modus operandi of converting those particular handsets. Now, as I said, the question that fell for consideration were twofold, and the court has answered both these questions in the affirmative. So the court goes on to say that yes, the handset of a particular company, or any handset for that matter, essentially is a computer system which is defined under the Information Technology Act. And if you reprogram it in such a way that you change, alter, or make any changes in the source code of that particular source documents of that particular handset, then you are in effect tampering with the source code, and therefore it's an offense which is committed under the Information Technology Act. Now, if you look at because that question will certainly come to our minds as to what is the importance of this particular judgment. Now, if you say basically from a forensic angle, the analysis reveals one, tampering of the source code to reprogram the phone, and from the procedural angle, it establishes the handset as a computer system, and it also criminalizes the tampering of a particular phone. So we have in 2000 basically come out with this particular judgment. If you look at it from the perspective of procedural aspects, it creates two different categories. One is that a handset or a mobile phone handset is nothing but a computer system. It has all the trappings of a computer system, and therefore the law relating to hacking or changing the source code of a computer would apply to that particular computer system, namely the phone, and therefore alteration of the source code of the phone would amount to an offense under the Information Technology Act. So this is a revolutionary judgment according to those times, and it dealt with an emerging kind of a new kind of an offense under the Information Technology Act, and therefore I thought that we should discuss this particular judgment. Next slide, please.
So what you will see is through all these processes, the forensic evidence is actually just trying to support scientifically through rigid scientific techniques that are proven, established in industry and in the courts of law as acceptable techniques. They are constantly strengthening and supporting a particular statement that is being used, or a particular point that is being proven in a court of law. They help to prove the case. Now, when we run this program, like I said right at the beginning, Ashish and I were very clear that we wanted to create something that would act as a forensic translator to bridge the knowledge gap that exists. Right now, what is happening is a lot of the times there isn't a thorough understanding of what the capability of forensics is. What are some of the standard procedures that are common practices that are used by forensic analysis? And how do we understand or interpret these reports that are generated by the CA, by the chemical analyzer, the expert, and brought to a court of law and presented in a court of law? What does this mean? How do we question this? So the program is designed to address all of these questions. And if you look at some of the syllabus points that we've put down, we will be talking about evidences at the crime scene, where it is extremely important procedurally how those evidence are analyzed, collected, recognized for their value, and then moved to the relevant forensic departments for analysis. Some of the safeguards and integrity issues will be looked at for the evidence that we talk about. Once it reaches the lab, to understand what does the lab do, what happens to that evidence in that big building, where does it go, what is done to it, and how are the reports generated. And last of all, the most important aspect will be taught by Ashish in the third module, where he will be spending time discussing how we use this information in a court of law in practice. So, how to actually understand the expert opinion report and then question the expert opinion report. And of course, always referring to recent case laws. So, finally, at the end, what we are looking at the takeaways in terms of the learning outcomes from this program is that the lawyer who is practicing or going into practice will have a thorough understanding of forensics at the crime scene, what should happen from the crime scene to the lab, understand what is happening in the lab in terms of what the analysis procedures are in a very simplified fashion, just the basic necessities to empower the lawyer to ask the right questions. Whether prosecution or defense is irrelevant. It is asking the right questions to get the right answers that you need that will be helpful. And Ashish sir will talk about the third point.
So yes, the third point is the one actually which is the most important point in my understanding is how does one deal with a forensic report? Because as a lawyer, once you enter a courtroom and you look at a chart sheet, you find several forensic reports, medical reports and forensic reports. Now the first challenge before a lawyer is how to decipher them. What do those technical terms mean? What is the meaning of whatever scientific terms that are used? uh, what are the standard operating procedures by way of which a forensic scientist goes about conducting his experiments, giving his findings, making his observations and all of that? And lastly, what are the good essential practices that he must follow so as to come out with a proper opinion? Now, once I understand point number 1 and 2, if you look at this pyramid, if I understand point number 1 and 2, I am equipped to understand point number 3. So, as a lawyer, I would look at a takeaway from this entire course and this webinar and whatever we are trying to tell you here is from the perspective of a legal professional. What does it mean when you look at this particular course? According to me, what it means is that I understand more and more of how forensic scientists go about doing their work. I understand more and more about how they apply the principles to come out with the findings that they come out. I also understand more about the various technologies involved. And once I understand them, I am more and more equipped to deal with them. Maybe to, as a defense lawyer, look at it from the perspective of finding faults with them, looking at the shortcomings, looking at the lacuna or the loopholes. As a prosecution lawyer, I look at how to give more strength to the existing reports, to the existing analysis, to the existing opinions of these experts. From the perspective of even a forensic scientist, if there is a budding forensic scientist who's addressing or who's interested in coming for this course, it tells him what are the do's and don'ts, what are the standard practices, what are the technologies that he has to look at, and most importantly, what does he have to do when he goes into the courtroom and actually encounters the examination in chief and cross-examination by the opposing lawyers. How does he conduct himself? How does he defend his particular opinion? So from all these perspectives, if you look, I think this course gives you a hybrid understanding of two separate or seemingly separate fields which actually are colliding with each other in the courtroom. Forensic science and law is actually merging with each other in the courtroom. Not only in the courtroom, they are merging right from the beginning. They are merging right from the investigation right up to the courtroom. So I think as lawyers, instead of looking at haphazard techniques or unorganized, ill-defined, ill-conceived techniques to deal with this, I think there is some relevance for us to come forward with this course, and therefore we are more than excited to basically talk to you about all of this, and we look forward to having a more educative and illuminative thought process in the course that we plan to conduct. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
May I take over, ma'am?
Certainly.
All right. Thank you so much. I don't think I have to add to the compliments that all the people have been sending to me in the chat box. The webinar totally commanded it, and it did two things for us. So I noted here कि ये बताना जरूरी है. First of all, it let escape different spirits of all the people. I saw that कुछ लोगों के investigative spirit बाहर आ रही है, कुछ लोगों की lawyer बाहर आ रहे हैं, कुछ लोगों की the drinking spirit बाहर आ रही है, कुछ लोग सिर्फ alcohol पे questions पूछ रहे हैं. So there are a lot for us. Second thing, it totally blew our mind. So I was looking out for the questions here in the chat. I thought there are questions, but especially at the moment when ma'am was telling about the Diana wala case, I had so many comments here that this is super cool. And there was someone who told me that it sounds like we are watching National Geographic, जहाँ पे हमें वो बता रहे हैं the gunshots and the holes were, corresponding to each other, all that. And also I've got a lot of questions. We'll start with that, telling everyone that I'll be sending the links here. One link, the first link would be for you to register your name and the phone number so that our team can call you up for the course. And the second link would be for your registration if you want to go and directly register and see the landing page and see all the information. So I'll start with the questions. Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, by all means.
All right. So the first question is the one question that I thought we'll first address pertaining to the course. Mr. Rachit wants to ask, how does learning about this course help me in my career?
Okay, can I take that?
Sure, sir.
So I believe Rachit is either a lawyer or wanting to be a lawyer. So I assume that the career is talking about is that of a legal professional. So I can say one thing, Rachit, that when I was a junior and we entered into the field of criminal law, especially trial law, our seniors always used to say that you watch and you grow. So we used to watch our seniors conducting cross examinations, especially of expert witnesses, because that has always been something which has been challenging. And my seniors always used to tell me that the more you know about a particular thing, the better armed you are to deal with it. So keeping in line with this, if this course gives you more and more information about forensic science and especially in its application in investigative machinery and the wherewithal and how does an finally a report is constructed, then you will be better equipped from both sides. If you are appearing for the prosecution or for the complainant or for the defense, you will be equipped to deal with a forensic scientist report as well as a forensic scientist in the courtroom. So I think that should answer that question.
May I just add to that a little bit? And that is that when you take this program, you will also be empowered from the point of view is, say, for example, you encounter a case that we have not touched upon in the syllabus. You will not be fearful of getting into the forensics because you will understand how to go and look for the information that you need. A lot of the times when I interact with lawyers, I know that a lot of lawyers today with Google, everything is Google Baba. will answer the questions. But a lot of the time you get overwhelmed with the technology or the terminology that is coming at you. So this will break that fear. Even self-research will be empowered.
Right, that's actually what I was going to add, because the case that we were reading about just now, Diana wala case, I think everyone who did not know that forensics could bring out what it brought out, they would have been helpless and hopeless कि इसमें अब कुछ हो ही नहीं सकता है. So if you know that these are the things that can help you bring out some circumstantial evidence and bring out to the court and understand them and solve the case, that would really help you to be confident in the court and you can take it confidently. So that should certainly help. So next question is, um, this is for Riva ma'am. Ma'am, how long do the traces stay for different substances and different kinds of touches? Can you please give a few examples?
So let me say that this is very variable, and a lot of the variation depends upon the circumstances of the case. For example, is it indoor? Is it outdoor? Are the weather conditions favorable? Is it hidden? For example, a rape victim, there is documentation and research has been done. A rape victim in a cold environment, buried in the cold, will retain semen samples for up to 30, 40 days. However, that semen sample could be washed away if the weather conditions are bad, or if the environment is bad, or if the victim has bathed themselves, you could lose. Fingerprints is another example that you can relate to. This is something that we all can relate to. Your fingerprints when you touch the door to walk in, a glass door, or your windows on your car or at home, those last sometimes for quite a few days because you didn't clean it off, even though it is exposed to the atmosphere. But at the same time, if somebody cleans it off or if it rains, those fingerprints disappear. So there is no one answer for all of this. What I would say positively is that it is completely dependent upon the circumstances surrounding the case. And of course, there is far more chance or risk of destruction of evidence when you have an outdoor scene versus an indoor scene, because an indoor scene, the environment will secure the evidence a little bit better.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Sir, this one is for you. Can a lawyer oversee the process of a forensic lab? Because many times government labs get managed by the other party. How can we make sure that this does not happen from a lawyer's view and scientist's view? And this might relate to chain of custody that you taught us.
Can I start, sir?
Yeah.
This
It's
is
actually, it's actually you should answer this question because
this is
I
a very,
also
very,
had this question.
this is a very exciting question. I'm dying to answer it. Um, this is my passion. This is why I keep saying awareness, awareness, awareness. The minute you know what to ask in court, you are overseeing the process. But what happens more often than not is nobody in the courtroom understands what is written on those reports, and darke they will just accept. They will just admit the report. Ask about the report, ask about the techniques, and the only way you will feel strength and empowerment to ask is if you educate yourself on the knowledge that you require. And therefore, this program, sign up for the program. It will teach you a lot of the basic standard operating procedures that disappear in terms of transparency, maybe, or process or fear, which you would now be empowered to read about, understand better, and question.
So I think you were going to add something to it.
No, I wanted that answer from madam only.
Acha.
On record.
Spoken like a true lawyer.
All right. So also everyone who was raising hands and they could not type or whatever the issue may be, you can tell me if you want me to unmute you. I'll unmute you and you can ask your questions personally.
No, I can see some questions. See, there is one question. Can the time of rigor mortis fluctuate according to the climatic condition? Can madam take that question?
Yeah, of
So
course. Should I repeat it, ma'am?
no, that's fine. I can answer. The time frame of rigor mortis can vary slightly based upon climatic conditions. Yes, of course. It can be slowed down and it can be speeded up based upon the temperatures. However, the actual long-term process is more or less the same. So in terms of using the rigor mortis time estimator, it is usually declared in ranges of time. It will usually not be declared in precision. It will not be, say, exactly 2.5 hours since death. It will not be declared like that. It will be declared as a range of time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I can't speak to the questioner, but I think that was an adequate answer.
Thank you.
Radhika, I hope there's no, this was sufficient. If you have any extension to the question, you can put it in the chat box. And the next question is, for WhatsApp message as forensic evidence, both mobile sender and receiver need to submit in the court.
Okay, now, so this opens up a huge box of what is Section 65B and how do you demonstrate or how do you prove electronic documents in court? So, of course, I really can't paraphrase all of that, but to answer the question in a nutshell, is WhatsApp messages are electronic documents. So, the moment you take a printout of a WhatsApp message, you are taking a secondary evidence of a primary electronic document, and therefore you require to accompany it along with a 65B certificate. 65B is a section of the Indian Evidence Act, and of course all of us are familiar with it. So yes, it is admissible evidence. Does both sender and receiver need to submit it? Difficult, because in a contested case, the receiver might not accept your messages. So there is a possibility that he might deny those messages completely, in which case the other corroborative material has to be looked at, whether those messages were sent or not. For example, in a WhatsApp situation, the service provider may have a role to play in order to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that there were messages sent from A mobile to B mobile.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there's another question by Rajesh ji. He wants to ask, till how much DNA in sweat in clothes can be traced for prosecution?
Technologies have advanced to the point of touch DNA. So now technology exists where touch DNA can be amplified. This micro quantities that you find in sweat when we touch an object can be amplified and then analyzed. However, a lot of the times, standard operating procedure of government labs will not allow for the latest technique. There are multiple reasons for that, which I will not get into. So we do not do touch DNA, but extraction from a very sweaty t-shirt is enough DNA to be able to amplify and get a profile, obviously depending upon the quantity of sweat.
So how long does it stay, ma'am, for like a little quantity of sweat, which also transpires and everything happens?
Depending upon the conditions of storage, this could last for a week, 10 days. It just depends upon how the item has been stored. Sometimes even longer. A lot of the times much longer. This will vary based upon the evidence on which the DNA is deposited.
Okay. So there's another question from Kapil Kothari. He wants to ask, can you learn about phenolphthalein in corruption cases test and spectrography test?
Okay, that is phenolphthalein.
Phenolphthalein.
This is a chemical which is used in trap cases or corruption cases under the Prevention of Corruption Act. So basically, the notes are applied with this phenolphthalein, and it leaves a particular color when it touches the human skin, and that is an indication that those tainted notes were received by the person who was asking the bribe. So of course, we will talk about that in the course, and spectrography is something which I think Madam can speak about.
For voice analysis, this again we can touch upon in the course. We're talking about audio-video authentication. This is a technique that is used where you're looking at the spectrographs of the voice to understand the unique features. A lot of times in forensics, what we're focusing on is not the class features, not the common features. You're looking for the unique features because you want pinpoint accuracy or match. So the spectrograph is one of those instruments that can do that for you.
Okay. So another question from Evidence Act, Ashish sir. Rajeshji wants to ask, sir, you talked about non-inculpatory evidence under Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act. But the moment the accused leads the police to dig out some evidence, it could be incriminating as well. So how can you negate it being incriminating and inculpatory evidence? In fact, Section 27 is silent about inculpatory evidence. The language of the legislative provision categorically mentions that whether it amounts to a confession or not.
Okay, so I'll answer this with an absolutely clear-cut real-life example. Let us say an accused commits an offense and he commits it with a dagger. During the course, after he's arrested, during the course of his interrogation, he unofficially tells the police that I have committed the offense and I want to make a disclosure about it. Now, why I'm saying unofficially is officially, obviously, it can never be documented. But the police come to know, let us say that during the course of interrogation, they come to know that he is willing to make some disclosure statement. And disclosure statement is divided into normally two parts. First is that he makes a statement where obviously he says the entire thing. That he says that this is the manner in which I committed so and so. We, along with X, Y, Z, got together. We did this. We strangulated him. We killed him, and we buried that particular body somewhere or whatever it is. And that knife you can find that I've thrown in a particular nala, and it is particular at a particular place, which is not a public place. Now, again, Section 27 talks about whether things recovered from a public place is an admissible evidence or not. So let us assume this is not a public place. So now what comes into that evidence is both inculpatory as well as exculpatory. Inculpatory which means something that incriminates you. So in this particular narrative, there is a clear incriminating evidence that he has committed murder. Now, when a judge records this evidence, he removes the inculpatory part and he retains, or he's supposed to retain, only that part which is not incriminating him. So therefore, when you read Section 27, you will realize that only so far much of that information as relates to the discovery of that particular object, only that much is relevant. So obviously it removes from its scope anything which is incriminating. So he will certainly say in a courtroom, or sorry, in the Section 27 Panchanama, he is certainly going to say that XYZ happened, etc., etc. But that incriminating part of it cannot be used against him. That is how the law operates. So we look only at that particular sentence where he says that मैंने dagger so and so नाले में छुपाई, चलो मैं आपके साथ चल के वो चीज निकाल के देता हूँ. That is the soul of Section 27. Only that part of it can be seen, not the one where he says मैंने इसका खून किया and so and so and so and so.
Right. Also for this, I think Devman Upadhyay is one judgment that we can read. There is where Supreme Court has very elaborately discussed about how much has to be taken into account and how much not.
Correct. In fact, Bhiman Upadhyay goes back in a line of judgments which starts with Kathi Kalu Ogad. So Kathi Kalu Ogad was a judgment which basically pointed out the difference between what is discovered. Whether what is discovered is that which connects the offense, or whether it is discovered as an object or something else. So it's a very interesting topic. Section 27 by itself is a very fascinating topic.
Correct. Sir, another question from you by Mudita Tripathi. She wants to ask, how much importance does WhatsApp message hold in criminal cases? You've already told a little about it. Can we, specifically answer that?
Yeah, so of course, now with the expanding scope of technology, people are communicating with each other by WhatsApp, Facebook, and chats and all of that. So in order to prove that a particular thing has taken place or not, I think in the times to come, WhatsApp chats are going to be of extreme importance. So as we go ahead, the legal system will also catch up. See, right now we have Section 65B, which is the legal procedure for establishing how to prove a WhatsApp message. And as we go on, as the legal process go on, we will certainly have more and more of this.
All right. So we'll take the next question. Ma'am, this one is for you. Can we take up forensic science right after BA LLB, or is it not possible?
So it becomes a little bit difficult over here because you would have to do a double bachelor's. So that means you'd finish your BA and then you'd go into another BSc forensic science, because usually a master's in forensics is only after you finish the bachelor's. So you would be doing a double degree.
All right. Sir, also in the WhatsApp message thing, there was one question that when there's a judgment that it cannot be ascertained whether the person which the message purports to have come from can be proved to have come to be have texted by that person himself, because it could be someone else who's using the machine. So what's the status on that about WhatsApp messages?
See, there are judgments and there are judgments. So, in fact, the latest in that line is the three-judge bench judgment, which lays to rest the controversy of who has to give the 65B. So, there was one divergence of views where one judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court said that even if you are not the author, even then the 65B can be given under certain circumstances. But again, now the larger bench has clarified that that is not the case. In any and every electronic document, 65B is a mandate of the law. So to answer that question in a more practical way, we must remember that electronic evidence is not the only evidence before the court. So every evidence has to be corroborated by other evidence. The convictions can't be on the basis of only electronic evidence. So coming back to WhatsApp chats, if there is other circumstantial evidence, for example, there is a relationship which needs to be proved by way of WhatsApp chats, then there could be other things. There could be phone calls, there could be eyewitnesses, there could be other things. So the relevance, admissibility, and value of a particular evidence in a court would always be determined by other attending circumstances. I think that can, satisfactorily answer this.
All right. Thank you, sir. Now, another question by Aditya Arora. He wants to ask that as the government launched the new guidelines under IT Act for messaging apps, in which the government can command the companies that have to tell the government who was the creator of a particular content share on their app, but can also ask these companies to share the info of some particular person.
Raghav, are we answering all questions today or course के लिए कुछ रखना है?
So I think people are excited. We should do a few more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
If that's okay.
What was the question again?
So the question is about the guidelines that the government has passed, that the creator of a particular content, the companies, the messenger companies have to tell the government about the particular content and the creator of the content on the messaging app. So what is the status on that part of it?
I don't think this deals with criminal law in any way. It's a procedural mandate.
All right. So maybe we can elaborate on it in the course. I think that's a suggestion that we can use it as. And another question by Radhika: can the blood samples be retrieved from a crime scene if those strains are cleared by the criminal?
Yes, forensics, in terms of the scientific processes that are used, we adapt processes to our needs, and most of our needs are always with small quantities of evidence. So yes, if you've cleaned up a crime scene, there is still a chance that we can use phenolphthalein indicator or luminol indicator and find bloodstains that have not appeared visible and have been cleaned up.
All right. Sir, another question for you by Virat is there any provision where the lawyers can examine an expert?
Okay, so I don't understand this context of that question, but I'll answer it nevertheless. The lawyers can cross-examine a government expert, so there is no question about that aspect of it. Can a lawyer introduce a defense witness as an evidence? Perhaps that is what he wants to ask. So the answer is there is no legal bar on introducing an expert witness or a person who claims to be an expert of a particular field. But we must also remember that CRBC sets out certain sections whereby certain people or certain forensic scientists designated with the government laboratories are given a particular status, and the report submitted by them, unless they are specifically challenged, they are supposed to be admissible in a court of law. So that status your private person or a private forensic scientist will not enjoy. So first of all, you will have to establish his credentials in court. expose him to examination and cross-examination, and then you can probably introduce his evidence.
Okay. A very short and quick question for you, sir, by Vinay on Facebook. He wants to ask, the checkup or the examination that you talked about of the accused, is it the examination, medical examination that is done in section 53 CRPC?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, there are two questions that people wanted to ask about alcohol when you talked about toxicology. So the first question is there a way to...
ज़्यादा questions आ रहे हैं.
Yeah, this one is the last two for ma'am. So, and the quick questions. So, is there a way to flush out alcohol quickly out of your body?
Practical
Of
questions.
course. These are practical operative water, lots and lots of water. Dilute it out.
Okay. And also, I think you had touched upon this already. And another anonymous person wants to ask this. And he says, how much alcohol takes us to how much per ml quantity of alcohol in our blood?
I'm going to leave this for the program when we sit into the calculations. It's a calculation.
I think, yeah, I think it will be.
And there are a lot of factors that influence that number. So I think that will be in the program if we get it.
All right. So last question for you, and we'll wrap this question, webinar. So Aditya, who asked about the companies question, the companies who can be ordered to tell us about the creator of a particular content. He wants to ask if the court can command these companies to tell the court who was the creator of the content.
See, again, that question is context specific. So depending, see, because does the court have the power? The answer is yes. If you look at section 91 and some other sections of CRPC, the court has power to call for and summon any document and material which it feels necessary for the just decision of a case. So can the court call for these documents? Yes. But would it be in the interest of justice to call for these documents? Perhaps that only the facts of the case can tell us.
All right. Charu, can we have your question answered on email, please? Because I think we have taken a lot of time.
Charu, join the course, please.
We'll answer all the questions in the class.
Yeah, and also I think we have taken a lot of time, and we cannot take the people who are telling us to come on mic and ask questions. Thank you so much for so much energy and so much participation, everyone. I think it was lovely, and I have seen how the course has been designed and how sir and ma'am are excited about it and how the company is excited about it. You might think I'm marketing, that I'm doing, but this is going to be awesome, and you guys must look out for it. Check out the links that I've sent in the chat box. I'll not end the webinar now. Take your time, check out the page, check out everything. If you think there's something that you want to ask, you can directly contact me. You all have my WhatsApp number. You've all connected with me once or twice. So thank you so much, Riva ma'am. Thank you so much, Ashish sir. And I hope we're going to come back with a bang on 17.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. We look forward to seeing all of you.
And there are a lot of questions which are pending.
Yeah, more than eager to answer all of them.
Yeah, we'll be answering all of them in the course, and we'll consider them if they can be answered on mail also.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.